Okay, so let's see. Okay. I'm going to be like reading out of a number of different textbooks and stuff, but in the end of the book of Joshua chapter 24, okay, and let's see. Okay. So we're right here at Joshua. Joshua is still alive. Joshua is still alive, and he's given admonition to the people. But you got to note that even while Joshua is alive, there were still some problems in Israel. And we're going to look, we're not going to be talking so much about individual judges. Basically, we're going to look at the flow of the book so that you're just not kind of like reading the different stories of different judges. You want to see kind of like what's going on in the book and what is God doing, where are the people failing and why are they failing. So this is what so if you're taking the book of Judges and that's all we were teaching for this whole semester, we would be doing this and then we would be going through all the individual judges and stuff. But in this class, the whole point in a survey is so that you're seeing the flow of the book and seeing how it fits in with biblical history. So here's Joshua, and he's given his final address to the Israelites. And so, yeah, go ahead and close the door, Tony, okay? Okay. So Joshua says towards the end of his address, I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them. You eat of the vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant. He's reminding them, remember, that God gave the Israelites all those things. Basically, they only destroyed the fortified cities so that they could have a good stronghold, a foothold in the land. But then remember, the individual tribes were responsible for driving out the Canaanites in each of their tribal allotments, and God guaranteed them victory. That was God's guarantee, but in order to get victory, they had to be obedient to the Mosaic law. That was paramount. And so what Joshua is going to do, he's going to remind them that they were supposed to be obedient. And of course, the people are going to say that they were. So Joshua says, now therefore fear Jehovah, serve him in sincerity and truth. Now remember, Joshua's still alive. And then he says, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. And then he says, serve Jehovah, serve the Lord. So in other words, even while Joshua is still alive, he's telling the people, put away the foreign gods that are within your midst. So in other words, Joshua is already seeing a problem. The people they still have a lot of the idols, and there's still secret sins, that they're worshiping, okay? And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, to serve Jehovah, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. Remember, when Joshua would use that term, Amorites, that's one of the peoples, Canaanite peoples in the land, and it's just, when it's used this way, it's a general term that just refers to all the Canaanites. He says, so anyway, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So he's given this contrast. So the people answered and said, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went among all the people through whom we passed. And then they kind of recount, like a quick history. The Lord drove them out from before us. Of course we're going to be faithful to the Lord our God. But Joshua said to the people, you cannot serve Jehovah, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins. If you forsake Jehovah and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do to you harm and consume you after he has done you good. And the people said to Joshua, "No, but we will serve the Lord." So Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen Jehovah for yourselves to serve him." And they said, "We are witnesses." Now, therefore, he said, "Put away the foreign gods which are among you." So he reminds them again, put away the foreign gods which are among you. So in one breath, they're saying, we're going to serve Jehovah. That is our promise. That is our pledge. But nevertheless, they're still serving. They still have foreign gods among them, and they're not doing anything about it. So the people said to Joshua, "Jehovah our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey." So Joshua makes a covenant with them in that day, and then of course Joshua dies. And then we get into the book of Judges. So right at the end of the book of Joshua, he has the people swear again that they're going to obey Jehovah their God. So then in Judges, it is now up, book of Judges, chapter 1, it is now up to the individual tribes to clear out the Canaanites in their tribal allotments, the inheritances that they were given by Lot. Not by Lot, Abraham's nephew, but by the casting of lots. In other words, kind of like gambling, for Judah, you get this area, roll the dice. And that's kind of like what they did, except that God was controlling the dice. According to, what is it, Proverbs 16:31, kind of like the lot is in the lap of the Lord, or the roll of the dice, the flipping of the coin is in the hand of the Lord. There are no accidents. God brings up what he wants to bring up. There are no accidents. In other words, God controls everything that deeply. So after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked Jehovah, saying, "Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" And the first two tribes that Jehovah picks, of course, the main tribe is the tribe of Judah. And as we read chapter 1, we're going to discover that Judah was successful in driving out the Canaanites for the most part. So he and his brother Simeon, in other words, those two tribes, were together because in the allotment of Judah, say if this is Judah's inheritance, say they just had this inheritance here. Here's the Dead Sea right here. Judah has this inheritance right here, and Simeon has their inheritance kind of like, here's Simeon. They have their tribal inheritance right in the midst of the tribe of Judah. In other words, they're surrounded by Judah. Okay. Simeon, by the way, it ended up being a very weak tribe, kind of like their punishment also for, remember Simeon and Levi were the ones that tricked the Shechemites to get circumcised, and then while they're groveling in pain and agony, they came in there and they slew all the men with the sword. And so God judged them for that. They would be scattered in Israel, and they would never be like major tribes. That was God's prophecy back then. Of course, Levi became much more important because of the zeal of Phinehas, and when they stood for Moses. Actually, when the Levites stood for Moses, at the incident of the golden calf, because they stood for Moses, they were still going to be scattered throughout the tribes of Israel, but they were going to have the high honor of being the priests. So they were still scattered according to the curse, but yet then they became the priestly tribe. So anyway, Judah is going to be successful in driving out the Canaanites, except towards the end here. It says finally, they drove out everybody, but finally, so the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. Okay. Now, one thing God said was that he would drive the Canaanites slowly, but from a human perspective, this was just around the era, about 1350 BC, that if you possessed iron or iron weapons, it was like it's like you were the only nation that had the atom bomb. Everybody else had conventional weapons, but the ultimate weapon was weapons of iron. Everybody else is still fighting with bronze swords, and if a bronze sword goes up again. They hit each other with the sword's strike. An iron sword is going to cut a bronze sword in half. It's going to shatter it, or it's just going to break it. And so the lowland people, the Philistines, had the ultimate weapon, humanly speaking. So at this point, the Israelites, those of the tribe of Judah, are basically they're going to be hill people, and those along the Mediterranean coast. The Philistines had a stronghold there, which God was not going to allow to break, because God later on was going to use that to judge the entire nation of Israel, to test them later on, because God, of course, knew that even though the Israelites made a covenant that they would strictly obey him, he knew they would not. Remember, before they even crossed over into the land, they said the same thing. Yes, we will obey the Lord. They said that to Moses. And then God tells Moses secretly, I know that when they go into the land and they possess cities which they did not build, and they eat the fruit of vineyards and orchards they did not plant, their heart's going to get lifted up, and they're going to start serving other gods. They're going to think they did this under their own power, and then I will be forced to judge them, because they're going to marry the daughters of the land, their daughters will marry the sons of the land, and they're going to end up being unfaithful to me, and I'm going to have to judge them. So God has been saying that all along. But of course, the people keep saying, oh, yes, we will obey you, we will obey you, we will obey you. And then Joshua is like saying, well, why are you keeping those idols in your pockets then? In other words, they're saying one thing, but they're idolaters at the same time. So Judah and Simeon were somewhat successful, and they're the only ones that were really successful. Okay, now before we look at the rest of this, we're going to look back to Deuteronomy chapter 7. And just for a few verses here, this is Israel's foreign policy. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, about the first 7 verses, before they ever step foot into the land, this is what God tells them. When Jehovah your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and cast out many nations before you, and then he mentions the nations, the Hittites, etc. And when Jehovah your God delivers them over to you, now this is what they are commanded to do. You shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. That's the command. God says if they remain in the land, if they don't leave the land, your job is to exterminate them. Remember, they're under judgment. They're under the sentence of death. And so God is using Israel to discipline them. Remember, God gave them 600 years to repent, and they only got worse. So he says, you are to conquer them and utterly destroy them. And then he says, you shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughters for your son. And then here's why, okay? For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of Jehovah will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire. In other words, God says you are to remove all those idolatrous altars and practices. In other words, eliminate the Canaanites and eliminate all the religious practices of the Canaanites. In other words, God says you are to utterly purge the land. By the way, God had the same penalty for any Israelites too. If there was an Israelite city that started worshiping other gods, God said you are to utterly destroy that city and kill every person in it and burn the city to the ground. In other words, it sounds cruel, but what God was saying, if you don't do it, that cancer of serving other gods is going to spread to the entire nation. So if you don't cut out that cancer, in other words, the entire nation will eventually be judged and you will be removed from the land, just like I removed the Canaanites from the land. So that's the admonition in the law, in the book of Deuteronomy, and the people knew it. But here's what the people do. Remember, Judah and Simeon were fairly successful in annihilating the Canaanites in their section. But then as we look at the rest of the tribes, now this is the downfall of, this is going to be the downfall of Israel, and it's going to start their course of history in the land after Joshua, after maybe 25 years of being fairly obedient to the Lord. They're going to sink really fast as they go into idolatry. So as we go through the tribes, God gives you 9 tribes as he looks at them, okay? So he says, but the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. So in other words, and we're going to, as we go back, we're going to look at, who wrote Judges and all that stuff. But at this time now, the Benjamites are dwelling with the Jebusites. They're the people that hold that area around Jerusalem. And then it says, however, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but they did not completely drive them out. Remember what the law said. The law said you are to utterly destroy them, drive them out, but if they don't leave, you are to destroy them. Then it says, nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwell in Gezer, so the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. So that's Manasseh, Ephraim. Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites dwelt among them. They were put under tribute. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko and the inhabitants of Zidon or of various other cities. So the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Nor did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, but they dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down into the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres. So here, the Canaanites actually drove out the tribe of Dan. In other words, they're not being obedient. They're not taking hold of the promises of God. Remember, God promised them that if you don't obey me, if you start going into idolatry, if you make covenants with them, you're breaking the law. Because remember, Israel's foreign policy is you are to utterly drive them out. If they stay in the land, you are to utterly destroy them and destroy every vestige of their religion, because it will infect you, and then I'm going to have to judge you too. So in other words, God saw the religion of the Canaanites as being so destructive that God said, I will be forced to judge you and kick you out of the land, just like I'm using you to judge the Canaanites and throw them out of the land. By the way, when Israel was finally thrown out of the land, the Babylonians and the Assyrians were more faithful to what God said to do than the Israelites were. Because when the Assyrians came in, they obliterated the northern kingdom. When Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the southern kingdom, he was very faithful in literally destroying the nation and carrying them away captive. So they were more faithful as pagans than the Israelites were, who had the word of God, but yet didn't obey the word of God. Okay, so we're going to read what the angel of the Lord says, and then what God is going to do, since they were being disobedient. Okay, so now he says there's an appearance of the angel of the Lord in the first part of chapter 2. Then the angel of Jehovah, that's the pre-incarnate Christ, came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you from the land of Egypt and brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. So it was when the angel of Jehovah spoke these words to all the children of Israel that the people lifted up their voices and wept. By the way, if they would have been tearing down the altars, God would have been driving them out of the land, but they didn't. They on all counts, they were compromising. So God said, okay, you won't drive them out of the land. Now I'm going to leave them in the land. I'm going to use them to test you. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. That's kind of like our review, and then we're going to like get deeper into the book of Judges so that you can see the flow of the book. Okay, so we're actually going to look at some facets of the book of Judges, okay? So we're going to start off with the title. So the book title, Judges, everybody knows that. The book title is Judges, Book of Judges, okay? The English title, Judges, can be traced back through the Latin, the Latin language, Liber Judicum, to the Greek Septuagint, Kratai, which means judges, to the Hebrew Shofetim, and it means deliverers or saviors as well as judges. So I'll kind of put that up for you. So the English title, let me erase this here. Okay. Could you close the door? Because actually, I don't know what it is, but I actually start listening to them and I says, what was I talking about? Because I guess I'm just nosy by nature. So that's the Latin, Liber Judicum. The Greek, out of the Septuagint, is Kratai. That's not the Greek letters, but it's how you would say it in English. That from everybody remembers what the Septuagint is. It's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. So their title for the book of Judges is Kratai, which means judges, and the Hebrew is okay. I kind of broke it down phonetically. It's the Shofetim, okay, which means deliverers or saviors as well as judges. A judge back in that day was more than just somebody who sat on a bench and adjudicated, determined the outcomes of cases of law and stuff like that. So the English title is appropriate as long as the English concept of legal arbitration is expanded to general administrative authority, including military deliverances from Israel's enemies. So in other words, if you accept the fact that a judge could also be a military general and lead the armies of Israel or portions, then you have an idea of what a biblical judge was. So here's a simple outline of Judges. Okay, as we look at the entire book, this is what we see. First of all, we see Israel's failure in the Holy War. They did not finish what God told them to complete. In other words, drive out the inhabitants. So number one, Israel's failure in the Holy Wars. So first of all, failure to remove the Canaanites. That's basically chapter 1 all the way through 2:5. And then there was an introduction to cycles of apostasy. In other words, God is going to demonstrate the cycles that are going to be going through the book of Judges, and I'm actually going to put that up there so you can see it. And then number two. There are cycles of apostasy and deliverance. First, God defines it, and then God goes through 7 major cycles of apostasy. That's going to be inherent in the book of Judges. And then, by the way, that's chapters 3, 7, all the way through chapter 16, 31. In other words, when you actually read about the judges, it's from chapter 3 all the way through chapter 16. That's where you find out about the judges. And then in chapter 17 to 21, you find out the depths of Israel's failure. How bad did they fail? And it gives just two examples in chapters 17 to 21. So in their depths of Israel's failure, first of all, there's the breakdown of religious life, chapters 17 and 18. And then there's going to be the breakdown of social order, chapters 19 to 21. In other words, and what we're going to discover is that there was just going to be this spiral that was ever downward. We're going to get to the point where we're going to be at a place where the first judge was loyal to God. Remember, he was Othniel. Othniel was the first judge, but he was one of the ones that helped conquer the land. So if Othniel was the first judge, it shows you how quickly the Israelites apostatized and where God finally had to judge them. Remember, God said he would not bring any enemies into the land unless they failed to obey the law. And yet within Othniel's lifetime, they were already in a state of apostasy where God had to judge the Israelites. So let's look at an introduction to Judges. The author of Judges and the date of the writing. Jewish and Christian sources say that Samuel compiled the book of Judges. The phrase, quote, "there was no king in Israel," unquote, is used in Judges 17:6, 18:1, and 21:25. So there was no king in Israel, okay? So that suggests that the author wrote when there was a king in Israel, because he's reminding the people that during the period of the Judges there was no king. The book also says that Jebusites were in control of Jerusalem, and then it says they dwell there to this day. Judges 1:21. So whenever the book of Judges was written, it had to be written before King David captured the stronghold part of the city, which is in 2 Samuel 5:6. But it had to be captured there, but yet before there was a king. So it limits the time frame when Judges was written. So it had to be written sometime before David was king, or if David was king, it had to be written before David had captured the city of Jerusalem. So anyway, when did David capture the city of Jerusalem? About 1004 BC. So Judges was written during the monarchy of Saul, but before David became king. So the prophet Samuel becomes the logical choice, probably compiling the book in 1043 BC or shortly thereafter, somewhere in that range. Depending upon who you read, which Bible commentary, you're going to get different dates, okay? So let's take a look at the background and historical setting. So according to John MacArthur, Judges is a tragic sequel to Joshua. In Joshua, the people were obedient to God in conquering the land. In Judges, they were disobedient, idolatrous, and often defeated. According to the text, and this is like our official textbook here. So when I refer to the text, it's to this little handbook here. The period of the Judges was from 1375 BC to 1043 BC, a total of 332 years. It was the era of the theocracy when God was Israel's king. So let me put up a timeline here. And again, whatever study Bible you look at or commentary, like this book says 1375 to 1043, but some will say 1380 to 1040, 1030. In other words, there's some disputes. It depends upon how they intermesh some of the dates and stuff like that. So as long as you get the general time, I can teach what the textbook says, but I'm not. If you're within a few years or something like that, I'm obviously not going to take any points off just because you get the date's not exactly what I say it is. If you're off by 1,000 years, then I would probably consider, no, you just got the wrong date. Okay. So anyway, 1375 to, what did I say, 1040? Something like that. I even get confused sometimes with 1043. For a total of 332 years. Now that's more than the book of Judges. So where we get this extra distance, this extra time, turns out, of course, that we have to go all the way into 1 Samuel. Chapters, say 1 through 8, because there are two judges in the book of Samuel. Remember, Eli, the high priest, was a judge. And then remember, the book starts off with the life of Samuel. You know, remember Hannah, or Kana in Hebrew. She's praying for a son. And Samuel, of course, will raise up, he'll be the greatest judge, and he'll be the greatest prophet since Moses. Remember, Moses was hundreds of years before. So the last two judges are in this section right here. So the book of Judges itself, according to the text, is 299 years. Leaving, of course, about 44 years over here for Samuel and Eli. Any questions so far?
Eli the priest?
Eli the priest. He was the high priest. He was a judge. Yeah. So he was, in other words, he was the leader of the nation at that time. And you got to remember that before the monarchy, before King Saul, in other words, before there were kings in Israel, since there was no king and God was supposed to be the king and the people were supposed to obey God, the tribes were loosely confederated. It's almost like how, remember in America originally there was the 13 original colonies, but they were all autonomous and independent. And it was only later, after they had a president, that they all came together, you know, to become one nation. But before, there were like 13 individual, separate, autonomous units. So it was kind of like that. So the book of Judges was less than 332 years with probably 299 years. Eli and Samuel are found in 1 Samuel 1 through 8. Saul is anointed king in 1 Samuel 10:1, but is introduced in 1 Samuel 9:1. So basically, we're going to have a transition there. And I'm only mentioning that before we cover 1 Samuel so that you see that the period of the Judges went all the way from Judges chapter 1 all the way through 1 Samuel chapter 8, which includes the book of Ruth, which we're going to just touch on today. So once Israel had its people, law, and land, remember, you all remember a people, a law, and a land, God himself was to be their supreme ruler. In other words, God wanted the people to have a theocracy. In other words, no, God did not intend one human ruler to be in charge of the entire nation. God was going to be their king, and all the people had to obey the Mosaic covenant, and God said he would completely and totally keep their enemies away. Now, if there was no central government, if there was no monarch who could, exact, demand taxes and your sons and your daughters to serve in the army and all that stuff, you can imagine the amount of freedom that God was giving the people. I mean, we complain today about the government getting too big and all that stuff. Well, God was saying, you're going to have a minimum of government. You just obey my law. I will keep all your enemies out. And even when I give you a year off, there won't be any armies or anything like that, but God said there will be no enemies that are going to come into your land. And God only raised up local enemies when they were disobedient. But all the major powers, like Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, God held them to minimal power for over 3 centuries. In other words, there was no major power that would come in and take over the land of Israel. And remember, when God gave the sabbatical laws, remember, every 7th year, Israel, God would basically say, take the year off. Nobody works this year. Take the year off, use it to meditate, contemplate on the Word, use it for your festivals and parties. Remember in the sermon yesterday, the pastor was talking about God is into parties. He just wants them to be moral. And basically God had given them every 7th week, he says, take off every 7th week. You know, you work 6 days, have 1 day off, but on the 7th week, take that off. And then every 7th year, not only are you taking every 7th week off, but now God says, take off the whole year. Don't go out there, don't plant any crops, don't do anything. I will make sure that there will be plenty left over that's going to come up. It's going to more than feed you. God promised no poor people. Nobody was going to get sick. Remember, God said in Exodus 15:26, if you obey my laws and my statutes and keep my commands, I will put on you none of the diseases that I put on the Egyptians. In other words, God said you are going to be healthy. There will be no need of doctors. Basically, I'm going to keep away all of your enemies. You're going to become the head of all the nations, and I'm going to completely and totally bless you, so people will basically see, this is what you get when you serve the Lord. This is what he promised them. Unfortunately, what God promised just wasn't enough for the Israelites. They wanted more. They wanted their sin, and they wanted all that freedom too. By the way, Israel never kept the sabbatical law. They never ever once took a year off. Not once. Because when God removed them from the land with Nebuchadnezzar, God says, you owe me 70 years, where the land was supposed to rest. So you'll be out of the land for 70 years. The land will get 70 sabbatical rests all at one time, and then basically I'll bring back a remnant of you who still believe. So Judges comes on the scene because of sin and failure. So in other words, when you read the book of Judges, it is a story of sin and failure. The reason why there's judges to begin with is because Israel's in sin. If they would not have been living in sin, if they had driven out the Canaanites like they're supposed to, and they weren't starting to practice the immoral practices of their religion, God said there would have been no judges. There would have been no need for any sort of deliverance whatsoever. So there's going to be a cycle that we're going to see in the book, and it's going to go around 7 times. There's going to be 7 major cycles, and here's what it looks like. And so keep me from having to turn around all the time so you can copy this. This might even be in your Bible, but it's... okay. So first of all, they serve the Lord. Okay, they're serving the Lord. Then they went into sin and idolatry. Let's see. And then they became slaves. They cried out to God. a judge is raised up. And Israel is delivered. Okay. So here's the cycle, and this is the format for the entire book of Judges. Can everybody read the bottom part there too? Yeah, go ahead and, can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So go ahead and get that circle. Because basically, that's chapters 3 through 16. Every time you see the Judges, you're going to see this cycle, and God lays out the cycle in chapter 2. Basically, he lays this out. They come up under Joshua, they're serving the Lord. They go into sin and idolatry. And then because of their sin and idolatry, which means their idolatry, remember now they're worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth. And of course, the reason why the religious practices of the Canaanites was so destructive was that when they participated in the idolatry, it meant that they participated in the feasts to the pagan gods, which always, it's always involved sexual immorality. And so the people would partake of the sin. So what was the draw that drew all the Israelites into it? Looking forward to unrestricted sex. The same thing that brought Solomon down, the same thing that brought so many of the other kings down, and of course that degenerated, of course, into where they were actually sacrificing their own children. So in other words, they were following those gods because those gods were literally gods of sexual pleasure, and so both the men and the women would go into that. Then God would bring in a foreign power. So like the very first one, Othniel was the first judge, but when the Israelites went into sin and idolatry, remember Othniel, 20 or 25 years after Joshua's dead, God has already brought in a foreign power because they're already into sin and idolatry. Remember, a generation arose who did not know the Lord. In other words, the fathers, the parents, those who conquered the land, they didn't pass everything on to their children like it says in Deuteronomy chapter 6. You shall teach your children these statutes and these laws. You shall talk about them constantly when you're walking down the road, when you're eating your meals, at night. In other words, all the time they were supposed to be reminding the children about the law of Moses, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it. An entire generation arose who did not know the Lord. So in other words, they went from a generation that basically believed in the Lord into a nation of unbelief and pure paganism in just one generation. And of course, that's a warning for us. Boy, you guys don't, or my generation, remember, it's only a remnant of people your age that's actually getting saved. A good many people that are your age are leaving the church because the church isn't giving answers and they're not teaching the Word of God. It's difficult to find churches that will actually teach the whole counsel of God. There are few and far between. So that's the process that they would go through. So then they would become slaves. Remember, the first foreign power that God brought in was those from Mesopotamia, in other words, from the area of Babylon. God brought them in and they subjugated portions of the people. And then, of course, when they become slaves, God says, you want to serve the Canaanites? You want to serve these gods and what it leads to, then they became slaves, and so for a period of time, they're slaves. They can stand it no longer, and then they cry out to God, please help us. We repent. Please deliver us. Then God would raise up a judge. Remember the first one being Othniel. And then the judge would deliver Israel. And then now the people, they've repented, they're serving the Lord. They're serving the Lord. And then after the judge dies, go right back into sin and idolatry. And so the cycle just goes around and around and around 7 times. At least, 7 major cycles where that happens. So apostasy happened quickly. So the first judge, Othniel, was the nephew of Caleb and married Caleb's daughter, Achsah, for successfully attacking Kiriath Sefer in Joshua 15, verses 16 through 19. So Othniel took part in conquering the land and was also Israel's first judge. So I've used that word a number of times, Israel apostatized. So a definition of apostasy is a deliberate, knowledgeable turning away from the Lord. In other words, they know they're sinning, but they're going to do it anyway. So again, 7 apostasies are recorded in the book of Judges. In each of these cases, Israel became enslaved to a foreign power, repented, and was delivered by a judge. So, now we're going to put up a listing of the major apostasies, okay? Can I erase this? Okay. What I'm trying to give you is like the bird's eye view of judges, rather than just going through the text and you look at one judge and another judge. You get lost in the details and you actually don't even understand the flow of the book. So it's actually in a chiastic order, and a chiasm is basically you start at one point and you end at another point, and it's like it's a very poetic device. Okay. So first of all, you have Othniel. By the way, the numbers there, that's where you find it in the book of Judges. Ehud. Then Deborah. And then Gideon. Abimelech. Jephthah. and then Samson. Okay. You can even write that in a straight line, but basically you kind of like, that's called a chiasm. In other words, a lot of things that you start off like right here and you end up, in basically the same place. It's kind of like a poetic device. You can divide, by the way, a lot of the Bible you can outline this way. And that's basically the 7 major cycles that you go through in the book of Judges. I'll give you time to write that down. No matter where I stand, I'm in somebody's way. Now I'm in your way. Okay, you're done. Okay.
So basically, it's written that way so that way you can like reflect.
Yeah, it's written this way so that as you look at this judge, the qualities that he had, and you end up down here, you're going to see basically what Othniel was good for, his moral character and all that stuff. You're going to discover that Samson was totally devoid of any moral character and stuff. In other words, he's as the cycle goes down, we keep getting worse and worse and worse. In other words, there's this spiral. They keep going through this cycle, but the cycle is ever downward. Right. Even to the point where we're actually going to get to the point where, remember, the Canaanites were being driven out of the land because of their religious practices. And we're going to discover at the very end that the very practices that the Canaanites were being driven out for, the Israelites are now imitating. Even to the point of Sodom and Gomorrah. It got that bad. We're going to discover that here they were united, and they were united as they fought the enemy. By the time we get down here, they're basically at war with each other. Remember, and when we get to the example of how the social order is being destroyed, first the religious and then the political, remember the book ends with 11 of the tribes almost exterminating one of their own tribes. There was 2 civil wars during this period, but the last one, they literally almost exterminated one of their tribes. Remember, the tribe of Benjamin was almost obliterated completely. So in other words, they're fighting the Canaanites and on a united front, and here they're just fighting each other. So in other words, the theocracy is failing because the people refuse to obey the Lord. In other words, the pleasures of sin, and you'll see in the book of Judges, when they're worshiping, when they're immersed in idolatry, when they're worshiping the Asherahs and the Baals. Asherah, by the way, is it's like a Astarte. She's the female counterpart of Baal. All of these gods are worshipped. All of these idolatrous gods are worshipped in sexual practices. So in other words, what is the appeal that's driving the Israelites there is the fact that the Canaanites were practicing their religious feasts, which basically amounted to sexual orgies. And the Israelites, observing this while the Canaanites are right in their midst, are drawn into it also. I had read a quote one time from Dietrich Bonhoeffer about, when temptation seizes you, God is the farthest thing from your mind, and all that matters is that you satisfy the temptation. And it's at that point that God is completely and totally unreal to you. All that matters is satisfying the lust at that time. And so that's why God said you are to exterminate the people, you are to drive them from your midst and totally obliterate and destroy all of their places of worship, and to totally annihilate and get rid of the religious practices, which remember was always amounted to human sacrifice and, for lack of a better term, just sexual orgies. That's how they worshiped their gods. They were all gods of fertility, and of course they were all represented by performing the sexual act. So anyway, God said you had to destroy them, or you will be drawn into it yourself. And of course, we all remember Solomon. What drew Solomon away from God? His wives. His foreign wives. First of all, he accommodated them, and then he allowed them to actually build temples to their own gods. And within a number of years, Solomon himself was worshiping those own gods. And then God, of course, had to judge Solomon, who was purportedly at that time, according to God's own words, the wisest man who ever lived up until the time of Jesus Christ. But yet, being the wisest person in the world, he became a complete and total fool when he didn't obey the law of God. And he was literally destroyed through his sexual relationships. In other words, through his wives, because his wives brought in idolatry right into the monarchy. So Gideon is the only judge who opposed idolatry. You know, when you look at Gideon, remember when God chooses Gideon, he actually has him, first thing I want you to do is tear down the altar of Baal. That's the only judge who actually is pictured getting rid of idolatry. But after the 40 years of peace following Gideon's victory, there are no more periods of peace mentioned in the rest of the book. In other words, there's no more peace after that. Okay, I'm going to quote a few things in this book right here. And I'm just going to mention a few things about some of the judges so that you get an idea of what's going on. Remember, we're going to go by strict biblical principles. That's what this book is doing here. So the first judge, Othniel, is the only judge who is mentioned prior to his becoming a judge. He captured Kiriath Sefer and was given his niece, Aksa, Caleb's daughter, as a wife. So this account uniquely contains all the components in the cycle of the judges: sin, God's wrath, a foreign oppressor, God's mercy, deliverance, and then again renewed sin. The second judge, Ehud, defeated the Moabites by secretly stabbing Moab's obese king, Eglon, in Eglon's chambers. In Judges 4 and 5, records the account of Deborah, Israel's only female judge. Now there's a significant departure here, and you're going to notice something here. Her victory over the Canaanites is the last Canaanite battle in the period of the Judges and could be considered the end of the conquest of Canaan. There was no more conquest in Canaan after Deborah. But the fact that Deborah functioned as a judge, particularly when considered along with Jael's heroic feat. Remember, Jael was another woman. She's the one that drove the tent peg through Eglon's head. Raises questions about the male leadership in Israel. So this concern is accentuated by the fact that Barak and the next judge, Gideon, balk at the idea of their assuming leadership. Remember Barak, not Barack Obama, but Barak, the general of that part of Israel, refused to go to battle unless Deborah went along to guide the battle and stuff like that. So in other words, he was deferring male leadership. Remember, God arranged it for the males to be in charge, like for the nation and stuff like that. And males, there were literally no males that would assume leadership. So God he chooses a woman to the shame of the men, which is what Deborah says, by the way, too. All right, she says, I will go and I'll be in charge, but you, Barak, will not get any credit for the victory that's going to entail in this military campaign we're going to go into. The credit will go to the women, not the men. which of course is a bad sign. In other words, male leadership in that era was literally going down the tubes. Remember when we look at Gideon, God had to coax him and urge him and try, build up his faith enough where Gideon would even take charge. He wouldn't do it. The Gideon account plays an important role in the author's purpose. Unique to this period is what approaches a revival of religious faith in Yahweh as Gideon pulled down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah. The eradication of pagan idols constituted what the nation was to have been doing all along. Remember, that's what they were supposed to do. God got them back. Remember, tear down their idols, destroy them. But remember, Gideon was afraid to do it. Remember, he snuck in at night because it was his father was worshiping Baal. So Gideon didn't want to go against his father, so he did it at night. But in the end, Gideon proved not to be a good example for the nation, for he led the nation into idolatry, fashioning a golden ephod from the people's gold, much like the golden calf, that the Israelites did in the wilderness. And remember Aaron, by the way, he collected the people's jewelry to make the golden calf. Well, Gideon collected the people's jewelry and he made a golden ephod. So from this point on, the narrative of the Israelites become adversarial to fellow Israelites. Now it's at this, after Gideon, now the Israelites start going, instead of fighting the Canaanites, they're going to fight each other. So when we get to Abimelech, so remember they're fighting the enemy here. Remember Deborah, they're conquering the Canaanites. They're destroying the people in the land. Gideon, they're tearing down the altars. And now the people are going to start fighting. In other words, now the tribes are going to fight each other. So in Abimelech, Gideon's son, he murdered 69 of his brothers and accepted the invitation to become a king. So this experiment in monarchical rule, a concern of the author from the formulaic refrains, resembles a pagan Canaanite king rather than an obedient Israelite monarch. Now Israel's oppression did not come from a foreign neighbor, but from one of her own judges. So now, in other words, the judge is doing exactly what the Canaanites were doing. The next judge, Jephthah, was the only major judge from the Transjordan area. That means, remember, Israel was divided. Remember, there were those people. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Dead Sea. Here's the Jordan River. 9.5 tribes are on to the west. And then there was 2.5 tribes on this side. Remember, the tribe of Manasseh was half on this side, half on that side. But Reuben, half of Manasseh, and the tribe of Gad were on this side. And so there was only one judge on this side. So Jephthah was the only major judge from the Transjordan area. There, that's where Jephthah was from. Unlike the other judges, Jephthah was called in a time of crisis by the popular demand of the people. He was promised to be the designated ruler if he successfully completed the mission against the Ammonites. Although God's Spirit was on him, he made an unwise vow to the Lord that he would sacrifice what first came from his house. Returning home, he had to sacrifice his only daughter to fulfill the vow. So whether he actually sacrificed her daughter, his daughter, or basically he exiled her to a state of perpetual virginity, scholars are like, they're still debating the issue. But basically he said he would sacrifice his daughter. So remember, they were already sacrificing their children in the land. So either view, I mean, whether she couldn't get married, had to be a perpetual virgin, or whether she was actually sacrificed on the altar, flip a coin, because depending upon who you read, that's what you're gonna see. Then we come to the last of the major judges, Samson. Samson, who perhaps even more than Gideon is a portrait of the nation in a miniature, as he blatantly violated God's instructions. In contrast with the other judges, Samson's dealings with the Philistines seemed to almost be of a personal nature rather than having anything to do with his role as his role as a judge. One of the ways the Israelites were to prevent the emergence of idolatry in the land was by avoiding mixed marriages. Remember going back to Deuteronomy 7, in verse 3, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, or take their daughter for your son. Of course, what was Samson's problem? Well, he wasn't interested in the women of his own tribe or even of his own nation, but he was fixated on the foreign women. Remember, Samson, when he's introduced, when you get a picture of his life, the first thing he says is, he sees a woman afar off, and he tells his mother and father, "Get her for me. She looks good to me." Doesn't know her. He sees her from afar and basically looks at her shape and says, "I want her. Get her for me." So in other words, what's he violating? The law said no mixed marriages. What's Samson going after? He's going after the Philistines and breaking the law. In other words, it's all about his own personal gratification. So he's the last of the judges that are described there. So Samson was involved with at least 2 relationships with foreign women. In doing so, he stands in contrast to Othniel, the first judge, who displayed virtue and courage in his marriage to Achsah. This contrast illustrates the moral and spiritual decline of the judges themselves. So in other words, you see the judges are going downhill. In other words, it's getting harder and harder for God to find anybody that's morally upright enough to where they can actually lead the nation. So when God chooses Samson, he's actually picking somebody that's committing the very immoral acts that the Canaanites are being judged for. Okay, and then we're going to get an example of 2 failures, in other words, in chapters 17 to 21. We have an examples, and these aren't chronological, but it gives you an idea of the sins that were happening amongst the Israelites at that time. So this period of the judges began with Israel fighting enemies it should have annihilated, continued with Israel engaged with foreign enemies because of her apostasy, and concluded with Israel fighting among themselves. So the spiritual condition of the inhabitants of the land at the end of the book is no different from the pagan inhabitants the Israelites were to remove from the land at the beginning of the book. In other words, they were no better than the Canaanites by the end of the book of Judges. So the first epilogue records the migration of the tribe of Dan and Micah's idolatry, chapters 17 and 18. While the second epilogue reports the rape of a Levite's concubine and the near annihilation of an Israelite tribe as the result of intertribal warfare. So these several events illustrate the depth to which Israel has departed from the commandment of the Mosaic Law. The sins included theft, idolatry, immorality, homosexuality, and abdication. Micah assumed he would receive God's blessing because he procured a Levite to preside over the worship of his manufactured idol. So, well, I'll get a Levite, and he can be the priest for my idol. So the accounts in the epilogue illustrate in a more graphic way Israel's tendency toward idolatry and scandal that was seen earlier in the book. And then in the very last section, and then we're going to take a break after this part. With this final section, the young Levite who journeyed to the hill country of Ephraim is counterbalanced by the Levite who traveled in the hill country of Ephraim to Bethlehem, from Ephraim to Bethlehem in chapter 19. There his concubine was raped and killed, stated in language remarkably similar to the account of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. In both accounts, men of the city surrounded the home of the guest, called for the visitors to come out to engage in homosexual relations, and were offered virgin daughters as a consolation. Comparing the activity of the Israelites to the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, the paradigm of abominable behavior in the Old Testament shows how low Israelites have stooped in their conduct. As a consequence of this deplorable event, Israel engaged in a civil war in which one of the tribes was in danger of becoming extinct. The holy war that was to be directed toward the Canaanites was now directed toward one of their own tribes. So from going here down to here, it shows you how morally degraded, in other words, how the spiral had gone down so low that the Israelites were essentially as a whole no better than the Canaanites God brought them in to judge. Why judge the Canaanites when they had totally adopted the practices of the Canaanites? And so the result was civil war. Why was the tribe of Benjamin almost exterminated? Because they refused to turn over the perpetrators for the murder and the sexual assaults and all that stuff. They said no. In other words, they were complicit in everything that they did. And so the other tribes, they hadn't sunk quite that low yet, but of course they had their own idolatrous sins, and so basically God uses that civil war to judge the entire nation. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We're just going to read a little section out of Psalm 106, and what it does, this Psalm 106, it reviews Israel's history, and starting at about verse 34. Okay, 34, I'm going to read 34 to 40. This covers the period of the judges, and it kind of summarizes what the period was like. So Psalm 106, verses 34 to about 40. So here's what God says. They did not destroy the peoples concerning whom the Lord had commanded them, but they mingled with the Gentiles and learned their works. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Thus they were defiled by their own works and played the harlot by their own deeds. And then verse 40, therefore the wrath of the Lord was kindled against his people so that he abhorred his own inheritance. Remember, God said that if they committed the sins of the Canaanites, God said he would vomit them out of the land. And that's God's terminology. He would spew them out of his mouth, vomit them out of the land. In other words, they would pollute the land with their sin, just like the Canaanites did. And God said, you're no different than the Canaanites, I will remove you. Which is what he did eventually, of course, during the Assyrian captivity in 722 BC, and then the Babylonian captivity in 586 BC, being the major deportation. So that's basically summarizes what the book of Judges is about. And so you're wondering, are we going to go in there and are we going to talk about specific judges? And the answer is no. Because you can do that. Got the bird's eye view of what the book does. You see this downward spiral, and as you get the picture of where the book is going, as you go through the book yourself, you can see the downward spiral. In other words, you're not just reading each judge as an individual unit, but you're seeing this downward spiral. They start off somewhat holy and dedicated to God, and the book of Judges ends in complete apostasy. It ends with civil war and almost the extermination of a tribe and the grossest of sexual sins. In other words, they were doing everything that the Canaanites were doing. Up here, they're united and fighting the Canaanites. Down here, the Canaanites aren't even in the picture. They're at war with themselves. And they basically, so you see this degeneration all the way through the book of Judges. Okay. One thing I did mention, there's 12 or, depending upon how you count them, there's either 12 judges or 13 judges. Some commentators don't count Abimelech as a judge, but most commentators do. So there's 12 judges that are listed there. And like I say, there's this, the descent is downhill. So when you have that picture in your mind of that cycle, just remember the judges, and remember each one of these is a cycle. There's a foreign power that comes in, and they go through that cycle. Then you're on the second cycle. When this judge dies, they fall into sin, and it just cycles. But the cycle, as they cycle through, they're going down until the point they're no better than the Canaanites. So that covers that portion of the period of the judges, and now we're going to look at the book of Ruth. And we're going to end up, we're going to look at where our timeline is, from Genesis all the way through. Okay. During the period of the judges, okay. So here is 13. What was the date I said? 1375. 1375 to like 1043 BC. So a period of 332 years. Remember, the book of Judges being like 299 years. This section right here is in 1 Samuel. And it covers the last two judges, Eli and Samuel. Okay, the last judge during this period that's chronologically is Samson. Okay, one of the things I didn't mention is no single judge ever controlled the entire land of Israel. And when God was choosing a judge, he basically chose them from the north, from the south, from the east. In other words, there were no two judges from the same tribe. They're all, basically God is choosing judges from different tribes. So in other words, God was spreading it around. And some of the judges, they ruled concurrently. They were there at the same time. So that brings us to somewhere here in the book of Ruth. And you all know the summary of the book of Judges. Basically, they start here, and they basically, by the time we get to Samson at the end, this is a moral decline.
Do you know which judges were judging during the same time?
I can't just offhand, I can't tell you, but I can get that answer for you though. It's not important for this course. Although, like when I do, I'm going to give you guys a handout on the judges so that those types of questions are going to be answered. Because, by the way, that's speculation on the part of different scholars and stuff. They don't really know. Because the problem is when you add up all the years that the judges ruled with the periods of peace and the periods when they were enslaved and all that stuff, you end up with a period of 400 and like, you end up with a period of 410 years. You end up with...
So it's like you wouldn't know which judges were, but you'd know that some of them definitely did overlap each other.
Yeah, and they guess which ones they were. Because remember, they were ruling in different parts of the... no judge ruled over all the tribes. So there might have been a judge in the north, but there might have been another judge ruling concurrently in the south. And so there's this overlap, but scholars just speculate as to which ones they were, and they just have their guesses, but don't really know. Yeah.
The downward spiral, that's mostly referring to the book of Judges rather than the whole period of Judges. Samuel was a good judge, right?
Yeah, I could have brought this spiral down through Eli and his sons, because remember, God said he was going to kill them. And God was going to terminate the high priest. In other words, God was going to cut off Eli's line because he didn't discipline his children. Basically, his sons should have been put to death. So God, since Eli won't do it, God's going to judge Eli, but he's still going to put the sons to death. and he's going to raise up Samuel. And Samuel is going to be the transition judge that's going to go from the period of the judges to the monarchy. Okay, and which we're going to cover. But first we're going to look at the book of Ruth. And so as we look at the book of Ruth, it's only 4 little chapters, and it's right after the book of Judges. It takes place sometime in the book of Judges. So like nobody knows when for sure, but basically maybe the book of Ruth, say, occurred maybe here, but who knows? Nobody really knows, okay? But sometime in here or here, the story of Ruth occurred. And there's going to be a contrast with the book of Ruth as opposed to the book of Judges. Remember, there's that downward spiral from worshiping the true God to worshiping idols and in other words, from going to worshiping God to be immersed in idolatry by the end of the book of Judges. That's how far down we go. The book of Ruth is going to be a contrast. Whereas the Israelites go from worshiping God to worshiping idols, when we go to the book of Ruth, we're going to see a Gentile woman go from worshiping idols to worshiping the true God. It's just, so in other words, the book is going to show that there were still some godly people in the era of the Judges. Just to let you know that not everybody was corrupt, but the culture itself was corrupt. Which should be, if you think about it, think of our own culture right now. There's a remnant in the land who hasn't given in to the culture. And but say for you, and I'm going to assume all of you here, you haven't given in to the culture, but you're seeking to live a life that pleases God, so you're literally going against the culture. So in the period of the Judges, the book of Ruth is there for quite literally a breath of fresh air. So as far as the author and date, Samuel probably wrote the book of Ruth about 1000 BC. So the purpose of Ruth, there were godly people during the era of the theocracy. In the book of Judges, Israel forsakes the Lord and turns to idols, whereas in the book of Ruth, one Gentile woman turns from her idols to serve the living and the true God. A second purpose, of course, is to show the lineage of King David. In other words, to make that transition from Judges to the monarchy, and where God, in other words, God is going to choose a man after his own heart. In other words, God's going to choose a strong national leader in order to lead the nation into the worship of Jehovah. Because literally as the leader goes, so goes the nation. So the concept of the kinsman redeemer is the underlying theme in the book of Ruth. And so it's important background information for the story. So as we look at, say, Leviticus 25:25. Let me just read that background. In Leviticus 25:25, remember that's way back in the law. We're going to actually look at just a couple of those laws right here, and we're going to look at the law of levirate marriage, or when an Israelite becomes enslaved or poor and can no longer stay on his land. You'll notice, by the way, when God gives a lot of these laws, he's presupposing that Israel's going to fall into sin. Okay, and we'll see that actually in the book of Ruth. Okay, so in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25, it states, "If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold." Okay, then on to about
It's 25:25.
25:25, and then 47 to 49. By the way, the whole chapter talks about this. In the book of Leviticus. Yeah. In verse 47, it says, "Now if a sojourner or a stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor," in other words, another Israelite becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him in his family may redeem him, or if he is able, he may redeem himself, which is usually not the case. So in other words, it's basically stating a near relative always has the right to redeem you. Okay, that's just the underlying message, basically, that the whole book of Ruth is predicated on. So as we look at the book of Ruth, just so you can see that this is in the period of the Judges. By the way, it's just a little short book, but you'll notice if you think about when God says he will judge the land when certain things occur, when there's apostasy in the land, one of the things that God says he'll do first is he'll send a drought as a warning. Okay, so as we see in the book of Ruth, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. Well, if there's a famine in the land, what does that mean? God is judging the nation. So in other words, they're in sin. They're already into idolatry. They're not driving out the Canaanites, okay? So there's a famine in the land, which is a warning. And it says, a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, by the way, this is one of those books, and it's, by the way, the same thing is true in the book of Judges and everything too, where the names play a major part of the story, which is basically lost in the English language. I'm going to read it as it says in the text, and then I'm going to read the definitions of the names so that you get an idea of what God is saying here. Now the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. Okay? And then it says, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husbands. Okay? Pretty straightforward in English, but when you read it in Hebrew, this is what they read. It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of the house of bread in the land of praise went to dwell in the country of God's garbage can, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was My God is King, and the name of his wife was Pleasant, and the names of his 2 sons were Sickly and Puny. Ephrathites, which means doubly fruitful, of the house of bread in the land of praise. They went to God's garbage can and remained there. Then My God is King, Pleasant's husband died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of God's garbage can. The name of the one was Athletic, and the name of the other was Beautiful. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Sickly and Puny died, so the women survived for her 2 sons and her husband. Literally, you can go through, and there's a word play on all the names, which is, by the way, it happens in a lot of the stories, but if you don't know the names of the meanings of the names, you lose what's actually being said there. Like when you look at Chilion, puny. In other words, he's puny, he's weak. He marries, Orpah means like deer or fawn, and the meaning of the name is like she's very athletic. And she marries Puny. That's her husband. And then Mahlon is the word for disease or sickness. He marries Ruth. Ruth has the name, meaning like, again, a name like pleasant or beautiful along those lines. Okay, so you get a picture that there's a famine in the land. So there's God is judging the country. So what do? My God is King takes his wife Pleasant, Naomi, and they go to dwell in God's garbage can because they heard that there was bread there. Remember, they come from Bethlehem, which means the house of bread, but there's no bread there. So they go to God's garbage can where they hear there's bread. So you get a picture of, a word picture of everything that's going on in Ruth. And so as you go through the book of Ruth, you're going to discover, that when Naomi, now all she has is just her 2 daughters-in-law, and you have this picture of like Naomi's going to head back home because she literally, when she leaves the house of bread and praise, Bethlehem, Lechem is the word for bread, and bed is the word for house. Judah means praise. They leave that area and they go to the land of Moab, and where all of the men in her family die. So now you got Naomi. She's going to go back home because now she's a foreigner in a foreign land, and she's destitute, and she has 2 daughters-in-laws that love her. So Naomi's going to try to convince her 2 daughters-in-law to go back home. So basically, in verse 11, Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?" Now, law of levirate marriage, okay? "Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of Jehovah has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." Then we have this famous line from the book of Ruth. So Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." A lot of women they use this in wedding ceremonies, not realizing that basically it was a woman swearing to not leave her mother-in-law. I remember my sister used this. She recited this to her husband when they got married. So anyway, that's pretty typical. So, and then of course, Ruth is going to meet Boaz. Boaz is going to be a picture. Boaz, by the way, means strength, and he's going to be a picture of the kinsman redeemer who's literally going to buy back Ruth, all the property of Elimelech, and basically father a son. And it's situated over the 2 harvest seasons. There's the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. In other words, the spring harvest and the fall harvest. The whole book basically takes place just in that era, right at that point. And then, of course, when the book ends, it's going to mention that Ruth has a son. Remember, in other words, Naomi is happy. She literally raises up her grandchild, as if it's her own son. But basically, what Boaz has done, he's raised up a son for Mahlon, the son of Elimelech. So in other words, so that their name would not die out. And you figure or wonder, why would Boaz marry a Moabite? Because it was against the law to marry Moabites. So anyway, there was a law in the Old Testament that said, that a Moabite shall not be, basically, they wouldn't be able to go into the house of worship for 10 generations, okay? I forget the law, but we'll cover it actually in another class, but we'll mention that law. So you look at the generations and you look what's going on here. First of all, why would Boaz marry a Moabite? Well, who was Boaz's mother? His mother was Rahab the harlot. So he had no problem marrying a foreigner. Okay, it was okay with him. And plus, Ruth had demonstrated that she was a chaste and pure woman. She was a widow, but she was chaste and pure. And what Boaz basically says, it says, blessed are you because you didn't chase after the younger men. Yeah.
If his mother was Rahab the harlot, doesn't that mean Ruth would have taken place in the earlier part of Judges? Because that's like back when like Joshua was around.
Yeah, and it also depends upon if any of the if there's people skipped in the genealogies. I'm leaving that open. I would personally place Ruth back here myself, but nobody knows for sure when it takes place. All we know is it was during days of apostasy, because how do we know there was apostasy in the land? Because there's a famine. God said he would only send famine, drought, if there was sin in the land. And why did Elimelech and Naomi and Mahlon and Chilion leave? Because there was a drought in the land. There was no bread in the house of bread. Okay, so that's the play on words and the ironic situations that are set up there. But Boaz says Ruth has not, he blesses her because she didn't go after the younger men, but instead literally went to Boaz. Literally said, she says, cover me with your skirt. Men wore, long robes at that time. She basically, grabbed remember, they're at the feast, and kind of get a picture of what's going on, because sometimes people think that Ruth was going to Boaz to have a sexual encounter with him, and that's not the case. But you have to picture that at the end of the harvest, say here's all the grain. And by the way, we have a picture. Ruth, if you want to use typology, Ruth can represent the church. She's a Gentile coming to the Lord, basically us in the church. Naomi is giving her instructions. She represents Israel. You never see Naomi and Boaz coming in direct contact, but she's always telling Ruth what to do. And we find out what to do, of course, from the Israelites and the Word of God. And so what Naomi suggested that Ruth do, but at the harvest, there would be a festival where the men would drink and be merry. They would drink lots of wine, and so they would be resting. But at night, they would be protecting the harvest. So all the harvest is done. They've had their party, and picture the men. The grain is up like on a hill, and all the men are asleep. Okay. These represent sleeping men. Okay. I know they look like ants, but that's okay. Okay. There's all these sleeping men. And so why are they sleeping this way? Well, first of all, they're guarding the harvest. I mean, it's out there, and they're sleeping around the harvest so that robbers and stuff like that won't come in and steal it. The fact that there is a harvest, by the way, shows that the famine is over. So in other words, God is done judging them at that time. What Naomi tells Ruth to do is to go to Boaz at night. I really like how J. Vernon McGee describes it. Basically, Naomi says, put on your best dress and put on your finest scent. And McGee, he's funny, but he says, put on your best scent. What is it? Oh, yeah, the perfume is called Midnight in Moab. Okay. Okay. And basically, let's just go, and we're going to go to Boaz here. Here's Boaz will be up here so you can all see. So they're all, by the way, they're all wearing robes. These guys aren't naked or anything like that, but I'm just showing Boaz's robe. So Ruth is going to come up, and this is what Naomi tells her to do. Go up when all the men are asleep, and go, and I want you to, we'll make Naomi blue. Okay. I'm sorry, we'll make Ruth blue. And what I want you to do is to literally lift up his skirt and cover yourself with it. In other words, put the skirt over yourself too. So anyway, she does that, and basically, you talk about women's rights back at that time. Basically, she was claiming Boaz as her kinsman redeemer. Basically, she was saying, I want you. And so now Boaz is literally obligated to do something with her or forever face the stigma and shame of not fulfilling his duty as a kinsman redeemer. But Boaz actually loved Ruth, so that he was actually, this was something that he was willing to do. In other words, when Ruth goes back to Naomi, Naomi says, don't worry about Boaz because he will not rest until the task is complete. So in other words, the kinsman redeemer, a picture of Jesus Christ, Ruth is there, and of course, once his robe is lifted up, it wakes up Boaz, and he looks down there, and there's a young maiden down at his feet. It had nothing whatsoever to do with a sexual encounter. What Ruth was doing was claiming Boaz as her near kinsman, because remember, Boaz was a very close relative of Mahlon, her deceased husband, and Elimelech. They were very closely related. So she was claiming him, according to the law of Leviticus chapter 25, verses 47 to 49. She was claiming him as his kinsman redeemer. So Boaz says that he's going to accept it. He gives her that blessing because she chose him over and above the younger men, which, by the way, says, that Boaz was an older man. And so she's choosing him, and basically they're choosing each other too because they love each other. But the choice was Ruth. Ruth had to take the initiative, and she had to choose her kinsman redeemer. In other words, it was up to Ruth to make the move. That's why I say back in that day, it's where the woman literally had the upper hand. Basically, she had to make the move on the man. She says, I claim you as my husband, as my kinsman redeemer, literally to marry me and to raise up, literally to redeem me, the property and all that stuff. In other words, redeem everything, the property, the people, everything. And then raise up a child, which won't even be yours legally, but will belong to my deceased husband, so that you can carry on his family name, not yours. So in other words, what the kinsman redeemer did was a complete and total sacrifice on his part. Okay, and of course, you ought to be able to see the analogy between Boaz and, of course, Jesus Christ. Basically, what he did to us, did for us, the church. So again, what Boaz does to show you how honorable he is, remember, he tells Ruth, okay, he gives her, a bushel of grain again, sends her home to Naomi, and has her leave, before the sun comes up, because he didn't want to do anything to tarnish her reputation. In other words, her reputation meant everything. In other words, he's doing everything he can out of love. In other words, he is protecting her reputation as being a pure, chaste woman, which she had already demonstrated over the months, during the harvest and stuff. And it's at that point, of course, that Boaz goes to the city gate, makes a proclamation. And remember, there's one nearer relative, which is going to represent the law. And he said, I will redeem the land. But then Boaz pulls out his ace card and says, okay, but when you redeem the land, there is the Moabitess Ruth, of which you're going to have to marry, and you're going to have to raise up a child for her deceased husband. Then, of course, the near relative representing the law says, I can't do it without basically tarnishing my own son's inheritance. So he declines, and he basically gives Boaz the right to redeem. So basically, it costs Boaz everything. It costs Ruth nothing, but it costs Boaz everything. In other words, he's paying for her property, he's paying for her, and he's paying for the raising up of a child, which won't even be his. legally. It's going to be in the name of her deceased husband, okay? So that's the honor that's being showed during the period of the book of Judges, just to show you that there were some godly people who were living in the midst of a corrupt culture. So it's just one of those bright spots that God shows at that point. Then at the very end, remember the law said that Moabite can be, they can't enter the congregation of the Lord for 10 generations. So you look at the end here, and if you count the generations here, verse 18. Well, anyway, let's look at verse 17. Verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom. That's after they have a child, and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed, which means servant. Have you ever noticed our worship leader, you know, on his, when he lifts his arm up, he has a tattoo right there, and you see something like, he has that tattooed on the inside of his arm. It means basically Obed or Oved, it means servant. So basically, if you wonder what his Hebrew tattoo means, it means servant. So anyway, they called his name Oved, or servant. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then it goes, now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. By the way, in Hebrew it's Peretz, and it literally means that it's a breach, it's a breaking forth. It's literally a word that's described when, say, a woman is giving birth to a child. There's a breach in the woman, and the child comes out. That's literally what the name means. So Peretz begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Aminadab. Aminadab begot Nahshon. Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz. And Boaz begot Obed. And Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David. So we have 10 generations from Perez. Remember who the mother of Perez was? Remember, it's Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, who basically threw herself at him and got Judah to commit a harlotry with her. She pretended to be a prostitute, and he got her pregnant. Okay, there's a picture here. If you look at the sort of detail of Judah and Tamar's daughter-in-law, you'll wonder. Like when you look at verse 13 of chapter 4, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and when he went into her, in other words, they had sexual relations, the Lord gave her conception and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be Jehovah, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel, and may he be to you your restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better than 7 sons who has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom, and she became a nurse to him. And the neighbor women gave him a saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. Okay, so basically you have this blessing that's being given there. So basically, that's the story of the one bright spot in the period of the Judges up until that point. And then as we finish the Judges period, and part of this we'll sort of look at again next week, but I want you to see the entire period of the Judges. So as we look at the period of the Judges, is the period of the Judges is this entire period right here, 332 years. But the book of Judges, of course, is just from here to here, 299 years. And then you have this portion right here that's going to take place in 1 Samuel, okay? So as we look at the last two Judges, we have Eli the high priest in 1 Samuel 1. He is introduced when he observes Hannah, the Hebrew pronunciation, Kana, okay, praying for a son. And Eli and his house would be judged for not disciplining his own sons. And I just want you to see, he continues the line of basically being a bad judge, okay? And so, as we look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 2, I'm sorry, 2:12. It talks about the wicked sons of Eli. Remember, Eli is the high priest and the judge. Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. By the way, it was Eli's intention to pass on the judgeship or the rulership to that part of Israel, to pass it on to his sons. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook. And basically it's going to describe how bad they were. But when we get down to verse 17, it says, therefore the sin of the young men was very great before Jehovah, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. In other words, they were literally turning people away from God. Basically, the sacrifices would be brought in, and the meat was to be boiled. But basically, what they did was, we don't want to boil the meat. We want to barbecue the meat. No, we want burned flesh, not boiled flesh. I mean, the difference between having beef in a stew as to beef on a grill. Okay. But the law said it was supposed to be done a certain way. So the sin of the young men was very great before Jehovah, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. One of the other things, of course, that the two sons did, when young maidens would come up to offer sacrifices to the Lord, Eli's sons basically would proposition them and have sex with them. So basically, that was the sons of Eli the high priest. In other words, they were just as corrupt, basically, as the worst people there. Remember, they were not only priests, they weren't just Levites, they were in line to be high priest. So in other words, the religious leader of the nations, in other words, potential leaders, were committing fornication, or were committing immorality. In verse 22, there's a prophecy against Eli's household. Now Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So basically, Eli hears about it, but what does he do? Nothing, okay? Then in verse 25, let me read 23 through 25. So he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress. If one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father, because the Lord desired to kill them. In other words, basically God hardened their heart because God was going to judge them and have them killed. And then, of course, that's what actually happens to Eli. He is going to die, basically, when the Philistines attack. Remember, another round has come around, and now the Israelites go against the Philistines. The Philistines are going to conquer the Israelites. And remember, it's at that point, the runner runs up to Eli. Remember, he's in his 90s, and he's extremely fat. And literally in his 90s and extremely fat, literally when he hears the news, he falls over backwards and breaks his neck and he dies. And because he hears also that his two sons are literally killed on the battlefield when they took the Ark of the Covenant. And not only that, but the Ark of the Lord had been taken by the Philistines. So in other words, after all of that, Eli and his entire house is killed. And it's at that point, of course, that God literally puts the mantle on Samuel, and Samuel's going to be the very last judge. And he's literally going to not only is he the greatest prophet since Moses, but he's also the greatest judge, and he's going to rule over the nation of Israel, being their judge, their administrator, and their priest. And he's going to also be the pivotal person that is going to turn the nation. God's going to use Samuel to anoint the first two kings of Israel. First, God's going to anoint the people's choice, and then God's going to anoint his own choice. So he is the transition from Israel having judges and the nation having God as its king to having an earthly king like all the other nations. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 5 through 8. Here's what the people say. They say, look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. In other words, Samuel's sons are also unbelievers. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to Jehovah, and Jehovah said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So in other words, the people were willing to give up all their tremendous freedoms that they could potentially have so that they could have a monarch and be just like all the other nations. But in the last 332 years, isn't that what the Israelites were demonstrating? They wanted to be just like all the other nations, including practicing their abominable sexual practices and their idolatrous worship. So basically, that's the story of the judges, and now God gives them another chance. Rather than judging them and casting them out of the land, he's going to give them a monarch or a king who's going to greatly restrict their freedom, but perhaps they can at least be in the land for at least another 350 years. Okay, so basically that covers the period of judges from Othniel. Just write the bookends here. Here's Othniel to the point right here, Samuel. Literally bookends, and both of them are godly men. By the way, Othniel means Lion of God. Okay, kind of like Keith Fortenberry's son's name means Aslan, Turkish for lion. Okay, so, and Samuel, of course, means Shem. It means herd of God. Okay. So, any questions on the judges for what we've covered so far?
Two quick questions. One, were people living like to age 100 or so? Is this like a normal, like a generation is like, or a person's lifespan is like 100 years?
No, pretty much lifespans are going down very quickly at this point. Even in the days of Moses lived to be 120, and it says when he died, his natural vigor was not abated, which basically means that if Moses was married, it means that at 120 he could be sexually active. That's what it means when it says his natural forces were not abated. His eyesight was not dimmed. Basically, God just said, Moses, it's time to die. And remember, he takes him up on Mount Nebo, and God literally puts him to sleep. Okay? Because remember, he was not going to enter into the land. But in Psalm 90, which was written in the days of Moses, he mentions, okay, and Psalm 90 was written like after the first generation is dying in the wilderness. They refuse to go into the land. And so basically the whole psalm starts off, the people were wicked, they're frail, and they didn't obey God. But basically Psalm 90, a psalm of Moses says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you have formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man to destruction and say, return, O children of man, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night you carry them away like the flood. In the morning they are like grass which grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up. In the evening it is cut down and withers. And then it says, for we have been consumed by your anger. In other words, that first generation, God was so angry with them. Remember, the promise was, you will not go into the land. So then Moses is going to tell them, verse 8, you have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. In other words, their thought life has been exposed, okay? For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength, they are 80 years. So by that time, lifespans had gone down pretty much to what they are today. King David, by the way, lived to be 70. Solomon could have had a much longer life, but because of his sins, he died as a sick old man, about 70 years of age. God said, if you obey the law, says you'll live long in the land, but you didn't ask for a long life, but I will give it to you if you obey. But what did Solomon do? He tried everything under the sun so he could experiment with what gives pleasure and what doesn't. Remember, it's the Ecclesiastes is a book that shows life under the sun or life apart from God, different than life under heaven. In other words, living for God. At the end of Ecclesiastes, Solomon basically says, here's the wisdom I'm giving you after leading a life of debauchery, basically, as I've done all this experimenting. Basically, he says, fear God and obey his commandments. At the end of his life, when he'd tried everything that he could to get the pleasure that he wanted, he said it amounted to nothing. And basically, he ended with nothing but regret in his life. He repented. Some people say he didn't repent, but I would maintain the book of Ecclesiastes itself is a demonstration that he had repented, because he ends the book saying, obey the Lord, fear the Lord, in other words, love the Lord, and obey his commandments. Then you will live long in the land. Basically, that's Solomon's advice to younger people. He's telling people, don't do what I did. Just previously, he says, blessed are you when you dedicate your life to the Lord in your youth. So in other words, all of you young people, basically God gives you a special blessing because you've dedicated your life in your youth. In other words, when so many other people your age they're going to say, let me live a life of sin. Let me have fun in life first, according to their definition, and not before I give my life to the Lord where I can't have fun anymore. Basically, that's most people's ideas. You have dedicated yourself to the Lord. God promises you that you will have a much more rich and fulfilled life than they will ever have. So that's what he promises. The book of Judges is going to demonstrate the futility of that lifestyle and where it leads. It leads basically to judgment and enslavement. And literally, when I say judgment by God, but literally, even while they're alive, God says, I'm going to judge you. Your life will be miserable. You might think the sin is fun, but God says you will pay dearly for it. And as a biblical counselor, I can attest that, when I counsel people that say commit adultery and stuff like that, they might think it's fun and all that stuff, but in the end, the heartache, the bitterness, the wrecked lives of children, and I mean the devastation that is caused, it is definitely, there's a heavy price in this life that you pay. Scars that you literally carry with you the rest of your life. So basically, that's the book of Judges. Is there any more questions? Is there any judge in particular that you have questions about?
How did people get their names? Or did parents pick their names?
Sometimes parents pick their names, and sometimes God did.
Well, Naomi chose her own name. Like, she decided not to be called Pleasant, but Bitter.
Yeah, like she named, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. In other words, call me Bitter. By the way, Mara is the shortened version of Miriam or Mary.
I'd be bitter if I had that name.
Yeah. So anybody named Mary, your name means bitter. Okay.
one thing, Elihud, right? It says that he was like a left-handed dude,
Mm-hmm.
and he was able to conceal a dagger. And was that like because he was left-handed, and so they didn't check like the side?
Absolutely. Since most people, I'm left-handed, and by the way, you realize being left-handed it's a conversation opener. People will say, "Oh, you're left-handed." You know, and if I said something like, "Oh, you're right-handed," it's well, so you know, but if you're left-handed, you know, it you know creates a question. By the way, my two youngest grandsons, you know, they're twins, and since they're supposed to be like mirror opposites, you know, like I know like one of them, their hair in the back twirls one way, goes counterclockwise, the other one goes clockwise. So I'm looking at the next to the youngest one, and I saw him like eating with his left hand and throwing something with his left hand. So I have like 11 grandchildren. None of them are left-handed. None of my children are left-handed. I'm the only one. So I told my daughter, and she said, "Well, yeah, Dad, but Davis, he throws with his right hand too." And I looked, oh yeah, he's throwing with his other hand now too. I mean, he can throw both-handed too. It doesn't make any difference, you know. So I'm hoping that maybe one of them will be, I won't be the only left-hander in the family. But when it comes to the names, by the way, I'm going to give you the names of what the judges mean if you want to write them down. One thing I want to mention too, there's two judges in there like Tola and Jer, you know, like I'm going to read them because there are two judges where we literally know nothing about, and I'm going to give you a suggestion as to why they're even there, okay? So anyway, Othniel means Lion of God. I'll give you the Hebrew spellings too if you want them, but does anybody want, nobody reads Hebrew, right? So I'll just skip that part. Okay, Ehud means joining together. Shamgar, nobody knows what it means. Nobody knows what the root itself means. Deborah, or Devorah, in Hebrew it's actually Devorah, okay? And her name means bee, you know, like honeybee, or eloquent. And Barak means lightning or thunderbolt. You know, he's been there with Deborah. Good name. Name your kid Barak. It's Hebrew and it means lightning or thunderbolt. Okay. Gideon means a feller. That doesn't mean like a good feller, but it means like somebody who cuts something down, like you cut down a tree. He's a feller of trees or something like that. That's what Gideon means. Avimelech, okay, means father of the king. Avi is the word for father. Melech is the Hebrew word for king. Okay.
So he's the king's father, or?
It's just what his name means. His Gideon named his son father of the king. Mostly it's referring to God. Okay. Tola means, you hear a lot of Christian preachers talk about Tola because his name means little worm, and it's the worm that, you know, when you squeeze the guts out of it, it gives out like a purple dye, and so they use the worm guts, the worm blood to, you know, dye your clothes. In other words, make nice pink tops and red tops and stuff like that. Red, pink, okay? Anyway, that's what Tola means, and you'll hear a lot of people mention that. But what they don't do, if that name is significant, what about the other names in the story of Tola? And that's what we're just going to look at. Okay, Jer, which in Hebrew is Yair, okay, or Yir, that means he will enlighten or diffuse light. Jephthah, or literally in Hebrew, Jephthah, he will open or set free. You have Ibzan in Hebrew, it's literally Iv-Tzan, okay, it's like a TS sound. It's not a Z, it's a TS. It means great fatigue, referring to, of course, of the mother at his birth. Basically, the mother said after giving birth to him, "I'm tired," and so she named his son Yiftson. Okay, then there's Elon, which means magnificent oak. So you want to name, if you name your son the Hebrew name Elon, you can say him strong like oak tree. Okay, something like that. Avdon or Abdon means servile or hard slavery. Samson in Hebrew is actually pronounced Shon, and his name means splendid sun or great joy and felicity. Which, of course, he was anything but. Okay, that's basically what the names of the judges mean. But I want to just give you, there's 2 judges in here, and we'll kind of close with this. But as we look at Tola, and there's, like I said, there's just 2 of them. I actually did a study on this because, remember I said, when I was reading you the story of Ruth, I said that all the names are significant. There's a Hebrew play there, and lots of times when you read commentaries on the particular judge, you see lots about various ones of these. And as we look at Tola, it basically says in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. And then, of course, Jer. Let me just read these 2. It says, after Abimelech, we say Abimelech, but it's really Avimelech, okay? Avimelech. There arose to save Israel Tola, the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he dwelt in Shamir in the mountains of Ephraim. So in other words, you got lots of names there, so it goes out of its way to tell you where he is from, so it gives you a lot of information there. And then it says, he judged Israel 23 years, and he died and was buried in Shamir. So that's all you know about him, and typically when you read commentators, they're going to say, well, that's not a whole lot of information. And then we look at the Jer year. After him arose Jer, a Gileadite. He judged Israel 22 years. Now he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys. They also had 30 towns, which are called Havoth Jer to this day, which are in the land of Gilead. And Jer died and was buried in Kamon. So all you know about the Jer is that he ruled 23 years and he had sons and daughters. I'm sorry, he had 30 sons riding on 30 donkeys. So it's like, so you say to yourself, so what? I would maintain, so I've done lots of studies on like the Gematria, the meanings of the names and stuff like that, and it turns out, and I'm not going to say this is 100% sure because not many people write about stuff like this, that when you have this, you got to look at the names and you got to look at the numbers and you got to look at all the place names and what they mean. Like for instance, if we were looking at Jer, he's a Gileadite. Okay, so you got to look up what Jer means. Remember, Jer means he will enlighten, diffuse light. Okay, and he judged Israel 22 years. By the way, 22 has a good meaning and it has a bad meaning. 22 is a number for light. Okay, it's also the number for like being doubly evil. It's one or the other. It can be either one. But if Jer means he will enlighten, now the number 22, it also means to lighten. Okay, in other words, to give off light, to be a light. Okay, and now he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys. 30. Where does 30 show up? The price of silver, 30 pieces of silver, which the Messiah was paid for. Remember, it was considered he was worth 30 pieces of silver. Okay, so they had 30 towns, which he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys. Okay, when Christ was coming into Jerusalem, what was he riding on? donkey. So now you have the one who is sold as a slave coming in humility, riding into Jerusalem to present himself. Okay. So anyway, you look at, so he has 30 towns. In other words, there's those that are going to be redeemed. There's which are called Havoth Jer to this day, which are in the land of Gilead. And Jer died and was buried in Kamon. And I can't remember the name of Kamon, but when you put the two together, the first one, if you take the numbers, you take the place names, it looks like a picture of the death of Christ. In other words, right in the middle of the Judges, 7 and 8 out of a total of 15, smack dab in the middle. You have a picture of the crucifixion, and then you have a picture of the resurrection. And in other words, Jer, he will enlighten or diffuse light. Remember, what's the prophecy? That the Messiah would be a light to the Gentiles. And so you have nothing written about them except the place names and the place of their burial. And like you figure, so what that he had 30 sons riding on 30 donkeys who ruled 30 towns? So what? And I know where he was buried, but so what? Why would you give that information unless, like, in the names and in the numbers, there's an encoded message? In other words, there's a message there that's hidden in plain sight. And so I would maintain that right in the period of Judges, while the nation is spiraling down into depravity and sin and going to be judged, right smack dab in the middle, there's like a type or a picture of the cross and the resurrection. Just like, remember, it says in Galatians, at the right time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Right at the point when God was going to judge the world, he sends in the Savior to take the judgment. So like you have a picture right there of I would maintain that there's a picture literally like encoded right in the middle of the book of Judges that kind of talks about in the midst of all that sin and depravity, there's a great light that's going to be diffused, go out across the land. That's my thought, but I haven't seen any other people that does that, because in our day and age, we don't look at the names seriously. The only exception I've seen is like people like to take the word Tola, and they mean that as little worm, and then they use that as a picture of the blood of Christ, because remember when Christ said, "But I am a Tola and not a man." Remember when he's on the cross, Psalm 22, "I am a worm and not a man." In other words, he's shedding his blood. So people use that, but if that means something, what about all the other names? Why not just look up all the other names and stuff like that and see if there's a picture there? See if there is a word picture that tells a story. Then you know something more about what's being said than just that Tola was the son of Pua, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar. You know his genealogy, then you don't know anything else about him. Then you see where he's buried, and you say, well, so what? What did he do? Well, if Tola means something, why not look up the other names and see if you string the names together, tells a story. We see that in Genesis chapter 5, between Adam and Seth and Enosh, you go down the names. Remember, that's the gospel given in the Old Testament. Why would that be the only place where, in the whole Bible, where there's a message encoded in the names? So I would maintain that maybe if you looked at those, maybe there's a little message there too. By the way, you see the same thing with Elijah. There's a story of Elijah going up to King Ahab, and then it just stops right in the middle and says, oh, by the way, so-and-so was rebuilding the city of Jericho, and with the death of his first son, he laid the foundation. With the death of his last son, he basically, set the gate. Why? You could take that verse out of there and read it. It's like it doesn't even belong there. Why is it there? Yeah.
Joshua laid a curse on that city.
Yeah, but why mention it there? Why is it so important to put it in the text? Try removing that out of the text and read it. You wouldn't even know there was a verse missing. It's just like it's just inserted there right in the middle for no apparent reason. I would maintain there is a picture there that God is telling you. If you just look at the names, look at the curse, look at the name Joshua, by the way, son of Nun, because it mentions him. By the way, Yahashua or Joshua, it means Jehovah's salvation, son of Nun, or in Hebrew, Nun, it means the fish, but it has the idea that fish have lots of offspring. The curse, remember Jesus was considered a curse for us. Joshua, Jehovah's salvation, son of Nun. In other words, the son is going to be lots and lots of offspring. When you just look at the name Joshua, son of Nun, it actually tells a story. So there's things like that in the scripture, and like I say, right in the middle of Judges, you got one. In the midst, like I say, of all that depravity, right smack dab in the middle, there's these two judges where you don't know anything about them except these just, well, who cares that he has 30 sons that ride 30 donkeys that have 30 towns? And where is he buried? You know, if you look at the meanings of the names and the numbers and all that stuff, you got a story there. That's what I would maintain. Because God put that in the scripture for something. It's up to you, basically, to search it out and find out what it means. Some scriptures are easy to understand. Some of them take a lot of work. Okay. Any questions before we close? Oh. Yeah.
Where do you, the names?
Mm-hmm.
How you find the meaning? Where do you go to find the meaning?
There's well, like for instance, Jones's book of meanings of Old Testament names. That's a good place. Basically, every place name and person's name in the Hebrew Bible gives basically the definition for, except for Shamgar, which nobody. The root is a mystery, so nobody knows. So that's one, and then there's some that just do it in English. The Jones's dictionary will give you the roots of the words and where they're in the Bible, what the names mean, what the story is, and all that stuff. So, if there are no more questions, so when's the paper due? No,
Next week. No, on the 20th.
2 weeks. Yeah.
2 weeks from now. Okay. Oh yeah, I didn't want it next week, by the way, because I'm going to be gone like to 2 conferences this week, so I didn't want to have to correct homework papers immediately when I got back. So.